Hello and welcome to part 2 of classes and inheritance. So in the first part of this video, what we did was we went ahead and we defined a base class of person. It has two properties, the first name and the last name. It has an init function that'll go ahead and create instances of the person, and it has a WriteOutput function that will go ahead and write out the first name and last name of that specific instance that calls the WriteOutput function. So what we're going to do in this next video is we're going to go ahead and actually create a class, subclass, that will go ahead and inherit from our base class or our person class. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and copy our current person class into page 2 of our playground. So let me just go ahead and select it, and I will go ahead and copy that information over. So exercise 2, so I'll paste that information in. So what we have here is we have our base class created. So what we want to do is we want to define a new class called employee that inherits from person. So the first thing we need to do is we need to specify our class keyword. And then after that, we would specify the name of our class, which is employee. And then after that, we will go ahead and specify the class that employee will inherit from, which is person. So that's basically, when you look at this, this just specifies that the employee class will inherit from the person class. So when you inherit something from another class, what you do is you inherit all of the properties and all of the functions that are defined in that base class. So our employee class will inherit first name, last name, the initializer, and the WriteOutput function. So what we need to do now is there's a couple of variables, properties that we need to define for our employees. So these properties will just be part of the employee class. So let me go ahead. The first one is our employee ID, and that will be an int. And then the second property will be our department, and that will be a string. Okay, so we've defined the two properties are just specific to our employee class. So the next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and write our initializer. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we will type in the init keyword, and then we're going to type in all of the parameters that need to get passed in to create our employee instance. The first two parameters that are passed in are the first name and the last name. So I will just go ahead and Command C this and paste this information down below. So each employee, in addition to having an employee ID and department, will have a first name and last name, which it inherits from our person class. So then the other two properties I need to initialize are both the employee ID, which is defined as an int, and then the department, which is defined as a string. Okay, so those are all of the properties that need to be initialized when we actually create an instance of the employee class. So what we need to do next is we need to go ahead and specify values for each one of our properties. So again, we're going to use the self keyword since our parameters will match our property names. So the first one, we're going to go ahead and specify employee ID, and that'll equal to the employee ID that gets passed in. And then we need to go ahead and initialize our department. So that'll equal to our department parameter that gets passed in. And then, as you can see, we still need to initialize the first name and the last name. And it's kind of letting us know that we haven't called our super init yet. So that's what we need to do next, is we need to go ahead and call the initializer for our person class. And again, you can go ahead and use autocomplete to specify this. And what we're going to pass in for our first name is our first name parameter that gets passed in. So I will just write first name, and then I will tab over and I will specify our last name. So basically what this is doing now is, in order to create an employee instance, we need to, in addition to passing in the employee ID and the department, we must specify the employee's first name and last name, and those properties are inherited from our person class. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and use our init function to create an instance of employee called imp1. So what we need to do here is, it'll just be let the name of our instance is imp1, and then what it'll be data type of type employee. So I can go ahead and hit enter to use autocomplete. And then here's another great use of autocomplete here. So I can just specify the parentheses and hit enter, and it has added all the parameters. So all I have to do is fill in the values for the parameters that will be passed in. So the first one will be Teresa. The second name will be Ruiz. The employee ID will be 8890881, and the department will be accounting. Okay, so we've specified the values or the parameters for each one of the properties for an employee. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this. So if we go ahead and run this, over on the right we see that an employee instance has been created, and if I want to look at the results, we have our employee instance with the first name of Teresa, last name of Ruiz, employee ID, and the department is accounting. So what we're going to do next is we're going to use the dot notation to go ahead and print out that information. So we'll just go ahead and use our print, and it'll just be our imp1. And then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and print out our first name, and then we'll print imp1. And we'll go ahead and specify our last name. And as you can see right here, basically we can see all the properties that are associated with our employee instance. And those do include the person property, since we're inheriting from the person class. So we'll specify last name, and then we'll print imp1 again, and what we're going to print out is the employee ID, and then finally we'll go ahead and print out the department. Okay, so we will go ahead and run this now. So we see the information for our instance, Teresa Ruiz, 8890881, and the department is accounting. So if we go ahead and look at our person class, we have a WriteOutput function, and basically what that displays is the first name and the last name. So instead of using dot notation to print the four properties, what we can do in our subclass or our employee class is override that function that's found in our person class to basically print out the employee ID and department in addition to the first name and last name. So that's what we're going to do next, is we're going to go ahead and create a WriteOutput function in our employee class that will override the WriteOutput function in our person class. So the first thing you need to do is you need to type in the keyword override and then func and then the name of it. As you can see, it actually knows, the Swift knows that what you're doing is you're trying to overwrite the WriteOutput function, since that's the only function in our person class. So I'll just hit enter, and then I will go ahead and write out the code. So the first thing we need to do is, in order to display the first name and last name, we do not have to write just copy and paste those print statements down. What we can do is we can go ahead and call our person WriteOutput method to write the first name and the last name. So after we've done that, then all we need to do is we need to specify the two properties that are just part of our employee. And that is our employee ID. And again, we'll use string interpolation to go ahead and display that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and print out the department. So again, it will be department, and we'll use string interpolation to grab that property. So now what we've done is we've overrode the WriteOutput function in our person class. So now when we call it from our employee class, we can print the first name and last name by calling the super WriteOutput function, and then we'll print out the employee ID and department for the instance that's calling the method. So we've completed this step right here. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and call the WriteOutput method to print employee 1's instance information. But before I do that, what I'm going to do is I am going to actually define a new employee. So let me just go ahead and define imp2, and that'll equal, and it's an instance of employee, and first name will be Saul, last name will be Steinberg, the employee ID we need to specify, and then the department. Okay, so we've basically defined our employee 2. Then now what we're going to do is we're going to call the WriteOutput method to print both employee 1's and employee 2's instance properties. So let me just go ahead and specify employee 1, and what I want to do is I want to write the output, and then I'll add in a blank print line, and then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and print out employees 2's information calling the WriteOutput function. So what this is now telling Swift to do on line 63 is I'm calling the WriteOutput function on our employee 1 instance. So it'll go to the memory location where the information for employee 1 is stored, and it'll print out the first name, last name, employee ID, and department. And then when I call it on employee 2, it'll do the same thing. It'll find that information in memory and print that information out. So let me just go ahead and hit the run key. And it is currently running up above. And what we have now down below is we have Teresa Ruiz, and then we have Saul Steinbert's information. So it looks like it's printed out the information correctly. So basically that is what I wanted to cover, inheritance. What we covered is how you can go ahead and create a subclass based off of a base class, and how you can override a function within that base class to include information about the subclass that was created. So we will go ahead and talk to you later.